Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this program, which is designed to give our viewers a little more insight into the doings in our capital and some of the personalities involved in politics in and around Salem and the state of Oregon. Our guest today is a gentleman who's been very much involved in what is a hot topic these days in the legislature and in the state, and that is the issue of corrections. Where do we go? Where have we been? What sort of philosophy do we want to apply in the system? And what do we do about limited resources these days in corrections and throughout the whole system of state government? And without further ado, I'll turn to our guest, Frank Hall. Say welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. Good to be here.
You are now one of the key people involved in this whole corrections discussion, but before we got into that, I wanted to give you a chance and our viewers a chance to know a little more about you and talk a little bit about who is Frank Hall. Can you tell us about where you're from?
Well, you know, you'd said something about corrections being a hot topic, and I've been responsible for correction systems in other states, and my life before I became part of the West Coast was on the East Coast. And it's always a hot topic. I mean, I've never been in any place in the country where corrections wasn't a hot topic. And I think it's part of the reason is that there's so many people have an opinion and have an interest in this issue. But it's also going to be a very expensive business, and that's certainly created a lot of interest in recent years. My background is primarily in the corrections area. I graduated from Syracuse University with a master's degree in public administration, spent a couple years jumping out of airplanes, and then somehow, as I think a lot of people before me, kind of got attracted to corrections and got involved in it, got interested in it. And
I'm going to stop you there. A couple of years jumping out of airplanes? Tell us about this.
Well, I spent 2 years with the Army, with the paratroopers, and I always said that I probably got involved in corrections because I must have landed one too many times on my head. But as a result of an interest that I had, I actually went back to when I was an undergraduate because I actually did some work as a correctional officer in a corrections program while I was still in college. After I got out of graduate school, I got involved as an employee of the North Carolina correction system. I spent a number of years there and then went from there to run the Massachusetts system for about 6 years. Then went from there to run the New York juvenile system for several years. Then I went to become Secretary of Public Safety and Corrections in the state of Maryland, which was a different kind of job because it was state police, corrections, parole, probation, everything under one department. Had the opportunity to work in local government for about 5 years, establishing and setting up a large urban correction system at the local level. And then Governor Roberts asked me to come here. It's been exactly a year ago that I came to Oregon.
It's hard to believe that it's only been a year. I would have guessed 2 years, but it's been 1 year.
Well, there are days it seems to me like it's been a week, and then there are other days it seems like it's been 20 years. So, but I've liked being here. This is a great state with good people. And I always say this when I get a chance to meet with groups on the outside, and taxpayer groups particularly. I think you're getting your money's worth in corrections of the state. You've really got some really fine people that work in the system. These institutions are clean, they're well run, they're safe, people are treated with respect and with dignity, but people have to follow the rules here. I think we have some pretty solid accountability in the system here.
Now, I'm going to ask you, when you made the decision to come to Oregon after being selected for this position as Director of Corrections, did you have any preconceived notions about what Oregon was all about, what kind of a state it was?
Well, I did, and partly because I'd visited here on a couple of occasions, but also I'd known people from here, and I think I've known just about every director who's been here over the last 20 years. I had some personal knowledge of almost every director that's been here in the last 20 years. I was aware of some of the things that Governor Roberts was doing in the state, some of the things where the state's been a leader, and not only Oregon benchmarks, but of course the whole area of land use policies, and a lot of areas where Oregon really seemed to be kind of out in front of the rest of the country. And it fascinated me also because having spent much of my life on the East Coast, I mean, you can really get appreciation of sort of the problems and the issues that develop when you don't do some planning and you don't do some thinking about what kind of government you want and what kind of state you want to live in and what kind of quality of life you want for your people. And I was struck by the fact that people in Oregon seem to care about what goes on here. And there seems to be a lot of caring about each other here, which I don't think is typical so much of what's going on in the rest of the country or California or some other areas that I've had an opportunity to work in.
Do you think that that's something that we can work at maintaining as part of our quality of life in Oregon?
Well, the biggest concern I have now, Kevin, and I've heard you talk about this in various forums, is that with ballot measure 5 and this sort of propensity to want to go out and undo a lot of the good things that have been done, I think we're going to be in danger of losing some of the things that we've done and some of the areas where we have been a leader. And, you know, I was in California for the last 5 years before I came here, and I could really see the impact of Proposition 13, which was, you know, California's version of ballot measure 5. And at first it didn't impact, but as time went by, and again, I've heard you talk about this very thing, as time went by, services began to erode, the educational system began to erode, and some of the areas where California had been a leader, suddenly that was no longer the case, and the leadership had gone, and California, I think, is going to pay. I think even today, some of the economic problems in the state are partly as a result of this sort of, I don't know whether it's the selfishness or whatever, but it's like suddenly people don't care or don't seem to be as concerned about their neighbors.
Well, if we want to talk about economic development or maintaining the economy, I would imagine that a business that was looking to invest somewhere on the West Coast, taking a look at the economic situation in California and the problem with infrastructure and government, and then comparing that to, say, Oregon, where we're sort of on the verge of some problems but haven't ended up with those problems yet, and we still have an opportunity to avoid them, would say, well, Oregon certainly is a better choice.
And I think they would because of the quality of the workforce here. You know, people are pretty well educated. There's a real strong work ethic in the state. I see it in the correction system. I see it with, you know, correctional employees. But there's a real strong work ethic here. And if you were going to start a business, and of course, you know, everyone knows a new business always operates right on the margin, and the difference between success and failure is the quality of those people that are going to be working in that business. This would be the place to come, I think. This would be a place that I think there's really a great future here.
Well, we're challenged now to try to deal with the financial situation that's facing us, a self-imposed financial crisis, trying to find out how far we go with government, how we fund it. But let's assume for the moment that we don't find, temporarily at least, the finances that we need to boost government operations, but we're in a mode where we have to cut back and we have to try to get through the next biennium. And again, I'm not a proponent of that. I'll be first and quick to say that. But let's assume that that's the given situation and we're looking at the tough budget decisions. Give us some idea of what sort of decision-making process you've gone through as you've taken a look at our correction system and where we're going to be for the next couple of years.
Well, I think my arrival was a timely one in a sense, because ballot measure 5 has been a reality since 1990. I walked in the door a year ago, and as I came in, the department was engaged in a rather extensive planning process where essentially the sort of key people from all over the system, along with some of the people from local corrections, such as the director of the local correction system right here in Marion County, Billy Wasson, people sort of came together and said, what is it we're doing, and what do we contribute to public safety in this state, and how do we do it, and is there a better way of doing it, or are there some things that we're not doing that perhaps we should be doing, and are there things that we're doing that maybe aren't necessary, that really don't contribute to where we're going as a correction system. So, Kevin, we sort of redefined our mission, and we decided that we needed to have impact on the offender, that simply to build the institutions, that was an important process, and you know, and I know, and the governor knows, and the legislature knows that a lot of effort went into opening those new correctional institutions over the last few years. But clearly we had to look beyond that, and we had to look at also the fact that we have about 34,000 inmates who are not inside a prison in the state, but they're actually in the community. And they live in Marion County, and Multnomah County, and Lane County, and you know, every county in the state. And that we really need to have some programs, and we need to have a level of accountability for those individuals as well. You know, we can't just look to institutions, we also got to do some things in the community.
Let me interrupt you for a moment. And I know you're in the middle of this trend and thought, but I want to mention to our viewers that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, your host, and our guest today is Frank Hall, the Director of Corrections for the Oregon Department of Corrections. If you ever have any questions or concerns or comments, feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. Now, picking back, Frank, picking up where you were beginning to talk about the philosophy and the need to look down the pike.
We looked at the fact that we had so many people in the community, and that the people that were failing in the community, not successfully transitioning from prison back to the community when they were for some reason not succeeding once they left prison, are the fact that we have such a large number of people that rather than come to prison by virtue of guidelines of the state, they end up on probation in the community. And we looked at the fact that such a large percentage of people were failing and were coming into the institutions, and it's become about 82% of the 500 or so people that are admitted into the correction system each month. And we said, quite frankly, we've got to be doing a better job with that population. We've got to have more of an impact on that population. So we need to beef up what we're doing in institutions to actually deal with offender behavior, see if we can't change that behavior. And we need to beef up the programs that are in the community that deal with the inmates who are coming out of prison and going back to the community, and the inmates who are on probation that are under supervision in the community. I think it makes some sense, and it's really consistent with Governor Goldsmith's task force report that goes back to 1988 that said the state needed to build some new institutions and need to increase its prison capacity. But it also said the state had to develop those programs in the community if it was going to have a balanced correction system. So the approach has been balanced. The problem in all this, and I think an area that you and I have had many discussions around, is that we're trying to do this in an era of ballot measure 5. So we're trying to do this at the same time we're contending with some major, budgetary cutbacks. And I think if we were proposing some of these programs and we weren't looking at the possibility of losing some prison beds or losing some parole and probation officers, people could understand it and accept it. But I think it's difficult when we're also in an environment where we've got to also make some cuts within our system in order to achieve some level of responsibility with respect to the budget.
Well, if I understand it the way you're explaining it, it's sort of an expansion of the philosophy that we've been building on. You start out with saying, well, we have tough offenders, some of them, and they need to be kept off the streets.
Absolutely.
But you also want to deal with the fact that the reality is that many of these offenders will be back on the street at some point, so you want to have programs in place so that when they are released, there's some chance of success, that you won't have to run them through the system, you won't have to reincarcerate them, that they can get a job, be a contributor to the community. And of course, as you continue to expand it, I assume you want to get to folks before they get into the heavy-duty crime, earlier intervention, and we'll talk about boot camps as one of those aspects of this, trying to get in and make these folks go straight earlier on before they become a real heavy resource burden. And of course, you and I could also talk about much earlier things such as education and jobs and health care and the things that may cause people to move away from the mainstream of society, but setting the human resources issues aside and the education issues and looking at it in terms of corrections. If I understand what you're saying, we've had this limited resources situation, and as you're trying to expand the concept of what we do with corrections, there's a trade-off. We may not have all the beds that we need, we may not have all the resources in the community, and that's where the clash is. Well, how much can we do of what as we rearrange this puzzle? Am I reading you right on that?
I mean, you just summarized it in about 38 seconds in a way that I wished I had done, because I think you stated the problem very clearly. We're trying to do all this, again, in a climate where we also, to get there, we clearly are going to also have to make some cuts in various areas. And that's a hard combination of things. And it's very difficult for people to sort of understand that and to accept that. And the governor supported our budget up to 98% of what we had the previous biennium. But we can't get to where we need to be, and we can't impact on the number of people coming in these institutions without shifting some resources within that budget.
Well, tell me about some of the shifting. Are you talking about having to pay corrections officers more, or adding to community corrections, and maybe you could define that, or adding to post-prison supervision? What kind of dimensions are you talking about here?
There's not a dramatic shift. But my experience with this is any shift at all always creates a great uproar. But it really isn't a dramatic shift. What it says in effect, or what we're saying in effect, is that given the budgetary limitations, in order for us to do some additional and provide some additional services and programs in the community, and 34,000 people on the street's a lot of people, and and it's a public safety issue. We need to be dealing with those people. In order to do that, we're not going to have enough money to fund all the prison beds that we would like to have, or to fund all the people that we would like to have to do some of the supervision in the community. And we've got to make some choices within those limits. And I don't think they're dramatic choices, Kevin, but I think clearly when you talk about any reduction in the number of beds that are available in this system, after we've gone through this major building program over the last several years, I think people are going to be concerned, and understandably concerned. And I don't know any director of corrections who faces the loss of a single bed that isn't concerned. I think what we're saying, though, is we need the beds, but we also need some of those other programs if we're going to make the system work. And if we don't have some resources in the community, then we're going to need even more beds. We know we're going to need more beds because of guidelines over time, but we're going to need even more beds if we don't do some other stuff out there in the community.
Now, you've mentioned guidelines, meaning sentencing guidelines, and they have over time added some sanctions or made sanctions more severe. Of course, part of the budget proposal that's pending right now would say that, well, let's cut back on the guidelines by 15%. Now, how would you justify that?
I wouldn't. I think it'd be a tremendous mistake, to be very honest with you. I think politically it would be a big mistake, and I think it would shake the public's confidence in a system that's so new. You know, it's only, you were part of this in '89 when it was developed. If we talk, I think, with the public about the possibility that we're going to have to reduce the sentencing guidelines, I think the public will be absolutely off the wall. I think the only approach would be to provide the programs to impact on the inmates. And if we're going to need some more beds over time, then we're going to have to budget for that. And we're going to have to provide those beds. But I don't think it's realistic, with guidelines being so new in this state, to talk about cutting.
Well, let me ask you this then. In terms of the programs you're talking about, are you talking about programs within the prison walls, within the institutions, or programs in the community, or both? And maybe
Both.
you can give us some idea what you're talking about.
Clearly both. I think, let me give you just a perfect example. I think the alcohol and drug programs that we've opened and implemented, some of with federal drug money that's been available to us in recent years, are clearly having an impact. And where we run these programs up at Columbia River Correctional Institution up in Portland, at the Powder River Correctional Facility out in Baker City, and other facilities throughout the state, clearly we see an impact on the offender. And we follow the offender once they go back in the community, and we're seeing fewer rearrests, we're seeing fewer people drop back into criminality than we would have seen had they not participated in those programs. So clearly those programs are having an impact.
Let me interrupt you then. So we ought to say to some of those political hotshots who don't want to see a beer and wine tax increase, and we probably won't see one, unfortunately, because of the lack of votes, that if you really want to do something about crime, support a beer and wine tax increase where the funds are dedicated to drug and alcohol prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation.
To me, it's a prevention strategy. You're investing in the future. And when we can have the kind of impact we're having on offenders in terms of criminality, that is public safety. I mean, the citizens are safer. We'll have a higher or better quality of life in our communities.
So should I ask everybody who tells me, yeah, go on, Mannix, keep supporting prison beds? I'll say, well, yes, but let's make effective use of them, and will you support a beer and wine tax? I'm not asking you. This is a rhetorical question. Shouldn't I be asking them, well, then, will you fund the kind of programs that we need so that these people don't have to return to these beds once they're released?
Well, and you've been willing to do that, and I think that's important, because having the beds and having the ability to lock people up without a program to make any difference, it just simply is not enough.
Well, tell me some more about some of the other kinds of programs you're talking about.
Well, I think we talked about institutional programs, but one thing that we clearly recognize is that, we're trying to change the way we release people back into the community. And we need to get away from this idea that we can take an inmate out of the Eastern Oregon Correctional Institution at Pendleton on a Monday afternoon and give him a bus ticket and $30 and the phone number of his parole officer, and put him on a bus to Portland and hope that everything's going to work out. So we're in the process now of kind of redesigning the way the system works, so we'll have a program and a plan for that individual. So there's some kind of pre-release mechanism that takes place 60 to 90 days before that individual goes back on the street. And that would be the same for people coming back into Marion County or back into some of the other counties in this area. We want a program and a plan so people can be reintegrated in a way that's thoughtful, and they can be involved in the community in a positive way with some controls, but with some programs so we can get people out and successful, rather than just dump them on the street and then wonder and stand here amazed when they end up back in the system. So we're doing that, and that's an important part of what we want to do over the next biennium, you know, depending on how this budget process works its way through the legislature. The other part of it is that we want to strengthen the programs on the street. Because what we're finding, and I don't think it's a surprise to the people that know the business, is that supervision of people on parole and probation is not enough. That if the person has a drug program or has a drug problem and we're not actually doing something about it, then we're not going to really have an impact.
All we're doing is supervising a drug problem.
Fine, we will catch them one day maybe using drugs, and then we can send them back to prison. But the fact is, we know the drug programs can make a difference. We know that some alcohol rehab programs can make a difference. And we've even started a program that we hope to fund in this next biennium, a day reporting, where an inmate would actually have a place he would be required to come each day in the community, where we could test for drugs, test for alcohol, get the person involved in a program, make certain that we're looking for a job, and we're taking care of business. You know, there's some real accountability. Person's not just hanging out in a drug house somewhere or sitting somewhere alone in a boarding house simply doing nothing.
Let me interrupt you again.
It has to be both, institution and community.
I'm just interrupting you so I can mention to our audience that you are with us on Capital Insight in case you just tuned in. I'm Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, your host, and our guest today is Frank Hall, the Director of Corrections for the state of Oregon. If at any time you have any questions or concerns, or criticisms for that matter, please feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. Now, we were just talking, Frank, about the dynamics of what do you do with inmates, and they could be inmates who are actually already out of the system in terms of incarceration, but people that are under supervision and we want to get them back into the community. Do you have education and training programs that are all built into this too, or just the rehab programs?
No, we have some education and training programs as we speak today, but we think those programs have to be beefed up, and we really need to increase the number of programs that are available. Probably 50, maybe 60% of the inmates in the system, and there are 6,500 people within the correction system, are involved in some sort of work program, educational program, or a combination of work and education. And I think we do generally a little better in the Salem institutions than we're doing in some of the outlying facilities in the eastern part of the state. When I walk through the institution out of Pendleton, I still see a lot of inmates that are essentially without a lot to do. I mean, too much idle time, too much lost time.
That brings us to a question of inmate work, labor, construction, whatever, manufacturing. Prison industries is sort of a generic term for it. Do you see some real dynamics there where we should be trying to move towards, to the extent that inmates are not being educated or trained, they should also be put through a work program, which in a way trains them to working, to get used to working?
We love work programs. I mean, the problem is we have people that are lined up to be in work programs, and we don't have the work. We have a good industries program in the state where we have inmates working to produce goods and services within the system. We have some private sector employers in the system, and we'd like to get more. I mean, I hope somebody's watching your program today and that might be interested in coming in and employing inmates in a private sector program within the institutions. And we'd like to capture some of that job market that's now going overseas. Now, we have people here that would like to work, not only outside of prison, but within the prison system. And there's a recent federal study that was just published in the last few months that said that, you know, the inmates that participate in those programs generally do better once they're back on the street and once they're out of prison.
I would think at least it would get them used to the notion of having to work each day, follow a particular schedule, be responsible. And one of the other kickers in terms of pending legislative proposals, it would give us more of an opportunity to recover the cost of their maintenance in the institution, the cost of paying off victim restitution, paying fines and the like. Of course, you do have some rules that allow for some recovery of that right now.
No, and the inmates will say to us that, you know, if they had those kind of opportunities, that they should pay. You know, they should pay restitution, and they should pay for the room and board within the correction system. And there are very few inmates that really disagree with that notion.
So I take it from all your remarks that you're supportive of a push towards more employment of inmates in various projects.
And to keep it as much like the real world as we can do. I mean, it's still a correction system. We're still working in a corrections environment. But Fred Nichols, who runs our program, our industries program, has done, I think, a good job of trying to create an atmosphere which is more like what the inmates will find in the business community once they leave the system and go back into the community.
Now let me shift you to a boot camp proposal that we've heard about. And despite a tight budget, one of the things you have advocated for is setting up a boot camp program. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the philosophy and the practice of boot camp programs?
Well, boot camp is a relatively new idea. It's not so new now in some of the states. I think there are actually 26 states that have some form of boot camps. But it's a way of kind of organizing an intensive treatment effort. Most of the programs that I'm familiar with that I think have been the most effective, and I had the opportunity to set one up for women even 2 years ago, the ones that have been most effective are generally about 6 months in length. And it's not just the military training and the military aspect of it, although that's important. It's really all the things that you do within that program. It's the alcohol and drug treatment, it's the education program, it's the literacy programs, it's the work programs, because work is a real important component of that. So it's all the things you do within that program, I think, that probably have the impact on the offender, but you use this sort of military model as the way you deliver the program, deliver the service. And the ones that I've seen that I think have been most effective are probably the ones that are operating in the state of New York. And they do seem to be having an impact and seem to be very positive. And I think some of the states, too, have learned from some of the mistakes they made early on when they first got involved with this particular effort.
Now, do you stay out of some related issues in terms of budget, in terms of, for instance, indigent defense, the cost of providing counsel to those who are charged with crime, the question as to whether certain felonies ought to be downgraded to misdemeanors so we reduce the amount of incarceration and expense in the system? Are those issues that you're involved in, or do you just stay out of them during session?
Well, you know, Kevin, we try to have an opinion on everything, but we tend to get involved in almost any issue that's related to crime or corrections, and indigent defense is a good example of that. We're proposing legislation that you and I have had an opportunity to talk about that would provide for a whole different way of running probation in the state. So instead of dragging everybody back to the court and back before a judge and having to pay for lawyers on both sides, we're suggesting that a large majority of these inmates could be on probation in a system where the sanctions could be carried out by the individual probation officers in the field, and only if the inmate wanted to appeal that sanction or felt that he was somehow being unfairly or unjustly treated would it go back to the court. Otherwise, you could carry out the sanction, put the person in jail for a few days, place the person in a restitution center, place that person in electronic monitoring where they wear one of these devices on their wrist or on their ankle to keep track of where they are. It's a good idea, it's a good concept, rather than spend all this money for defense attorneys and prosecutors and judges to hear 10,000 probation cases in court every year. So we clearly get involved in almost every issue in one way or the other.
Where are those, and what are their chances for passage this session?
Well, they're all packaged. A number of bills that would change the way we do business are packaged in one piece of legislation now. It's Senate Bill 139. We think it's good, positive, progressive legislation. Not everyone agrees. Some of your colleagues don't agree. But we think it's a move in the right direction. And the only thing I ask people to think about, those that have a problem with the legislation, is that if we don't do something, and if we don't change the way we're doing our business today, that what may be necessary is to begin to change those guidelines, or do some other things that I don't think the public or the legislature or anyone is going to find acceptable.
So the challenge for us will be to try to do some fresh thinking about where we direct our resources, our limited resources, because as you're putting it, if we're not real aggressive about rethinking that, we may end up stuck with a situation where we don't have the facilities we need.
Absolutely, and I don't think we're suggesting anything particularly off the wall. I think what we've said is that we want to hold offenders accountable, and we want this to be a safer community. But we've got to think about the whole system. And some people need to be in maximum security, and you say it so well. Some need to be in maximum security. Others could be in the community with an electronic bracelet.
I'm going to interrupt you at that because that's a good wrap-up concept, that we have to be aware of public safety and the whole range of possible sanctions. And the reason I have to wrap it up is because our time is up. And I'll mention to our, yes it does, I appreciate you joining us today, and I thank our audience for joining us on Capital Insight, and I hope you'll tune in with us next time. Thanks again for joining us.